Welcome to the AnteDote. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Rothko.
Man, it's been probably, I'm sure this has been our longest hiatus. It's probably been over 3 weeks. And I will say that to those of you who have been, who value our input on things, I apologize for taking such a hiatus here. But we are indeed back in the saddle, and we're back to bring what I hope is our unique and insightful brand of analysis to events both current and historical. So we're back. And so, Jeremy, do you want to talk a little bit about the last few weeks, because it's a lot of developments and work related to your court case that took up a huge portion of your time. Do you want to give a quick update on that?
Yes, and it is very good to be back in conversation with you, Greg, and I apologize for having missed so many weeks here, both to you and for the folks that we are in conversation with out there. And it's been a ton of work in the last few weeks that my wife and I have been doing in relationship to the evolution of the federal lawsuit that I filed, mainly around First Amendment claims in regards to that May 9th, 2016 event that we both attended at the Kansas City Public Library about Truman, Israel, with the key speaker being Dennis Ross. And so there has been a lot of work recently, including multiple depositions, including my own deposition that went, I believe, over 9 hours. So that included counsel for certain defendants interested in certain aspects, even of our viewpoint and factual analysis here at the AnteDote. And so we welcome all new listeners, including members of opposing counsel who are interested in our viewpoint, because here at the AnteDote, we work as hard as we can to dig up facts that either are not well known or are potentially controversial, but are definitely important to an analysis and an ongoing understanding of our current and maybe past political moments, in ways that could actually create understandings that could help us build a better country and world moving forward. So there's been a lot of that, and there's also been a lot of work in terms of work that my wife and I have been doing around establishing and writing up the nature of the facts as best and as comprehensively as we can ascertain them. And so we have been helping put together an amended complaint that puts forth some of the claims in a maybe more accurate and more fleshed out way. And so I will continue to report as I can moving forward, but I'm happy to be back here on the AnteDote with you, Greg, and probably be a little bit rusty maybe in relationship to maybe like not riding a bicycle for a little bit, but we'll do our best.
Likewise, and I appreciate the summary of what our goal is here with the program, because my hope is that while a lot of the topics we discuss are indeed controversial and in a lot of ways very controversial, I guess you could say in a lot of ways conspiratorial, but I think that we really do strive very hard to very differentiate ourselves as much as possible from some of the more I don't know what the term would be, the more outrageous characters in the alternative media and the way things are discussed. And so I think, we strive to do that. And I personally think we do a pretty good job of that. And I hope that we can just continue that here and, get back to doing what we do in a way that I hope is informative and insightful, and also is actually working to, in some ways, I want to say, I want to be careful with my usage of terms here, but we want to, I don't know if the term is to alter the perspective of so much of what is conspiracy culture, things related to these very deep, very important, very controversial subjects. And so in the way that we present them, I just hope that perhaps there's a destigmatization in some ways of a lot of these topics.
Yes, yeah, and maybe some fresh eyes looking back at past facts that have maybe been written up in a certain way. So I think I agree with you that the idea of the altering, the potential, looking at things from a truly alternative perspective, but not in the way that even maybe the whole meme of the so-called alternative media has been maybe set up and framed as such, and that what we're looking into is altering or alternatives, not a singular alternative media that people can then figure out a new controlled narrative to believe every piece of.
Yeah. Anyhow, I think I think it's time to start getting into some of the things that we've missed here over the last few weeks. Of course, we had I think a very significant story that something that we had seen coming, that we had predicted could be happening for quite a while, but it has finally happened. I don't quite know the severity of it as far as what it will actually do with the actual consequences of what it will mean for Israel and also for other global interests that are affected by what happens with the internal politics of the state of Israel. But indeed, Benjamin Netanyahu has been indicted, I believe, related to three different cases. And this is something that we'd kind of seen coming for a while now. And what I'm getting out of this is that I think that and there have been some others as well, but I think we've done a pretty good job of documenting and bringing light to the fact. One of the things that we've talked so much about that I think is something that is not really within so much of what we know as the alt media has not really been made clear. And it is that from everything I can see, very much the same forces that are at least putting up the image of serious resistance to Donald Trump are also very much leading the charge in resisting the extremes of the excesses of the right wing in Israel under Netanyahu and what's been going on in recent years with and now what we're seeing really with the rise of you might call it rise of the right wing globally. And so my getaway from this, and as we'll talk about here, one of these cases involving one Arnon Milchan could very well go back to Trump and a lot of people within his inner circle and the circles that have made someone like Trump possible. But from my perspective that I can see, it's very much the same forces in a lot of ways are leading the charge against both Trump as well as the right wing ruling power in Israel. So.
Yes, and we've been tracking a lot of this from the beginning of this Trump administration in terms of how tight, in the midst of the investigations into the, whether the Russian background to some of the Trump investigations or the global mob, Eurasian organized crime background, how much of that really is very much directly tied into the highest levels of the Israeli government, specifically into the aspects surrounding Netanyahu. And we did some of the investigation surrounding Eric Prince's connections, not only into aspects of Russia and China in terms of his frontier services group or his apparent increasing role in things like what he calls logistics in relationship to potential major projects such as that China and or Russia are involved in the Eurasian continent, such as the Belt Road Initiative, but also things such as the development or so-called development in Africa and resource economics in Africa. We pointed out that there was also this very tight connection into the highest levels of the then Netanyahu's or former Netanyahu chief of staff, I believe, Ari Haro, and how a lot of these networks were globally pervasive, but were tightly constructed in these kind of axes from places like Tel Aviv, Jerusalem to Moscow, but then back through places like the Central Eastern Europe and the city of London, but then of course back into Lower Manhattan or all of Manhattan and real estate, and then down obviously now into DC. So we have been tracking that aspect of this, and it is interesting to see some of this come to the forefront in terms of actual potential legal action. And I believe the indictments against Netanyahu are on the verge of happening. There's one other step that needs to be taken, I believe, where it's presented to him and he has a chance to respond to it before he's actually indicted, I think. But it looks like it's about to happen.
Yes, and I'm glad you brought up going back into things like what you mentioned there with Eric Prince, and you're also seeing increased scrutiny. Do you want to, I guess, when we're talking about these connections to, because I think what you see at a really deep level, going back years, but also just in the midst of the 2016 election, you see this nexus and this kind of this continuum between elements of obviously the international Russian Soviet, based mafia based out of the former Soviet Union, along with obviously interests related to the highest levels, obvious Israeli interest, as well as interest within the right wing of the American political and establishment, particularly through organizations such as the Council for National Policy and all of its offspring within for example, the Christian Zionist movement, as well as other aspects of the conservative movement here in America, and then even and so you see a continuation of all of these interests where they seem at some level there are divergent interests. There are interests that are not always quite the same in sphere or in goals or in ultimate aims and whatnot. But I think there is a continuum where there is this at a strange level. At a level there is a connection, a kind of interconnecting of all of these interests together. And one area that I think is very significant with this whole investigation of what we're seeing now is one PsyGroup, and we were able, talking among ourselves, to find some very interesting information on the and that is now the investigation, whether the Mueller investigation, we're not sure what exactly it's going to entail, and we don't want to get into like a conversation about the legitimacy or non-legitimacy of the investigation. I think that's another topic for another time, and that's something that's open for speculation. But there is an area of the Mueller investigation that looks like it is getting into the funding and the financing of PsyGroup, and this is of Joel Zamel's PsyGroup, the Israeli kind of Cambridge Analytica offshoot company that was very much involved with a lot of this pre-election manipulation of things such as data, and so we're finding some interesting connections with the funding and the financing. And do you want to talk about that real quick?
Yes, and maybe before we do that, I just want to, before we go off too much from the Netanyahu, potential indictments here, and it should be said, of course, that moral people worldwide look at this and be like, certain political corruption and graft and things about fraudulent behavior in relationship to buying media properties and accepting gifts of cigars and champagne and stuff like that is really the least of the alleged criminality from someone like Netanyahu when you think about things about actual human rights, human lives, the ongoing occupation, the violence against the Palestinians, but then also back into things like the 9/11 wars, on back to the September 11th operation itself and his apparent proximity to the key aspects of that operation, from everywhere from what we've spoken about to his close connection to one Larry Silverstein over many years, talking to each other every single Sunday, and the obvious core to the 9/11 operation of the real estate deal being pulled together in the weeks to basically months before September 11th, but then also including his context of a long-term sort of behind what would be seen as enemy lines. If you take Netanyahu's quote from Fink's Bar in the early 90s seriously, after apparently that Israel had worked with others in nabbing certain five pieces of U.S. NSA gear in terms of certain keeping cryptological devices. In the wake of that, Netanyahu apparently was bragging at Fink's bar about basically taking down the United States of America as it was being used as an asset by Israeli power. So if you take all of that background of Netanyahu into account, it's definitely the case that things like political corruption is very minor. At the same time, you can see where certain mob characters are taken down by tax issues, right? I believe that's the case with Al Capone. But, of course, in the background there is things like multiple murders. So we do have to assess this in a moral fashion and realize that this is, not really Netanyahu being held to account. And I believe also at the same time, it looks like his wife and people like Milchan are being released from suspicion in these probes. And then one last thing on that case before we head more directly into the question of PsyGroup and the funding and the background of PsyGroup and what it might have actually been doing in the 2016 elections is this question that we had brought up before that I think people might want to go take a look at again, of this connection of Milchan, of Arnon Milchan, through his one of his best friends and long-term business partner, Andy Vajna, into the heart of Hungarian politics, and in relationship to one Viktor Orban, who we've also spoken about the suspicious background there in relationship to things like the Eurasian organized crime, the Mogilevich network, and specifically into things like Russian high-level counterintelligence, espionage, and potential blackmail in relationship to Orban's apparent shift in relationship to the Russian sphere. And then now knowing what we know about how tight this axis is in relationship to Russia to Israel, I think that connection, that Arnon Milchan, Andy Vajna, and by the way, the connection that we pointed out was that Vajna was at the highest levels working inside the Orban government in helping Orban solidify his, basically somewhat authoritarian control of Hungarian media assets society-wise. So I guess that's all on that. Greg, any comments on those subjects before we move into PsyGroup?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the Milchan Vajna connection, because once again, I think, and we've discussed how Hungary is kind of a significant epicenter of this whole coming together alliance, you might say, between certainly Israel and these Eastern European right-wing insurgent governments, as well as, and I do obviously the Russia-Hungary alliance, for example, is a completely open secret. I mean, it's something that's not, it's not a mystery to anybody. So I think that Hungary is significant to that, and the fact that you did have this Andrew Vajna, who was described in Variety magazine in 1991 as Arnon Milchan's best friend in Hollywood. And then, of course, you go into Milchan's history and what he's been involved with in terms of, Israel's nuclear program, and then even going on to make documentaries, films such as JFK, which, of course, was financing involved in that, which, of course, was Oliver Stone, who very much figures into the narrative, I think, of someone like Vladimir Putin that's being developed within so much of those who follow various alternative media. And so it is significant. It is also interesting that Andrew Vajna just died like a month or so after we did our program. But, digression aside, this is something it's something that really should be known by people. And these are the kind of things, as we're going to discuss when we do our next show, when we get back into the bigger overall media narrative involving people like Donald Trump and others of his ilk, that really never really gets discussed when you think about the really damning aspects of these actual governments and what they represent, and the rise to power, and the fact that there is a lot of very, very significant influence and financing and overall just influence peddling on behalf of these insurgent right-wing entities globally. So we'll revisit that, but this is very important, and it's something that people really should take a little bit of time to try and understand and realize the significance of.
Yes, and I want to wade into this PsyGroup issue because it keeps coming back up, and it's obviously a key piece of investigation in aspects of the Mueller investigation. But the question of what's actually going to come from it is, and aside from what actually exists there and what it actually represents, there was this interesting Twitter thread back from, I believe, from August of last year, of 2018, that I'd meant to bring up when we were talking about some of this stuff that I never did. So I was thinking maybe we could draw that in at this point in thinking through and doing an analysis of what the PsyGroup connection actually is and what the actual funding background means about these specific networks. And it's the Twitter account is from one Robert Young Pelton at RYP underscore it looks like to me, and he's an interesting author who's known to have traveled around the world in certain very hot zones, hot spots, especially around aspects of U.S. military operations. And I think he's drawn out some very interesting backgrounds here. So I'm just going to read through some of this, and maybe we can then comment on what some of these connections might mean. Okay, so this is from, I believe, this August 29th, 2018. Quote from Robert Young Pelton's Twitter account. Quote, August 3rd, 2016, Prince Nader, Trump Jr., and WikiStrat pro-texter PsyGroup Israeli intel pimp Joel Zamel and meet to push fake social media support, including honeypots and dirty tricks. Zamel,
like the description there.
Yes. The intel pimp, yes. And Zamel also has worked for Oleg Deripaska and Dmitry Rybolovlev. Jr. says niet. Hashtag complicated much? So, of course, Oleg Deripaska, we've spoken about a lot, and he's a key oligarch here, part of the Russian-Israeli axis, very much close to Putin, very much a key player in the aluminum industry. And definitely there's a strong case to be made that a lot of what of Trump and basically Mnuchin's as the Treasury Secretary, and then maybe also someone like Wilbur Ross, the Commerce Secretary, who's tied very much into this key financial nexus of Cyprus and Cyprus Bank, which seems to be one of, if not the key nodal point that connects Russia and Israel in relationship to these oligarchical organized crime networks. What they're actually been doing, it looks like, in a lot of the things like the approach to the economics is things like it seems to benefit certain people like Oleg Deripaska and aspects of his business background. And then the other part about this is that when you begin to look into the background of some of these networks, a lot of these Russian and or Israeli oligarchs, a lot of their businesses are specifically in things like in terms of metals and gas resource. They're resource oligarchs very often, such as people like Dmitry Firtash, who, by the way, in relation, we also saw the Michael Cohen in Congress testimony, and who, of course, is sitting right behind him is one Lanny Davis, who's not only the sort of Clinton DNC style fixer, but he's also has a long-term background as a representation of one Dmitry Firtash, one of the key, if not the key, oligarchs operating in the Ukrainian political context that is very much connected to the Manafort connection to Trump, and then what Firtash was doing was basically representing certain Mogilevich and Putin interests in relationship to natural gas resources in Ukraine and on back into Russia. And then of Dmitry Rybolovlev, who's mentioned here, I believe, is the Russian oligarch who ended up paying top dollar for Trump's former real estate. That he paid basically twice as much or more than Trump paid for it. And Rybolovlev was also, I believe, the Russian oligarch who was apparently seen as parking his private jet almost always in conjunction in some way in relationship to aspects of the Trump campaign in the midst of the 2016 campaign. And Rybolovlev is known as, I believe, like a fertilizer king. So there you go, resource oligarchs once again. So I'm going to continue moving on to the next tweet, Greg, unless you have any comments on this first aspect here.
I'll keep going, but it is interesting that once again, you see once again here, fact that you have this Joel Zamel relationship with one Oleg Deripaska as well as Dmitry. I always forget how to pronounce his name.
Rybolovlev.
Rybolovlev, yes. These damn Russian names. It can be very hard to pronounce sometimes. But once again, you have this connection here between prominent Israeli figures such as Joel Zamel, and then figures that are Russian figures that are very close to Vladimir Putin, as well as obvious figures that you think of when you think of this organized, global organized crime syndicate that's very much involved in things such as natural resources and things of that nature, which would be used for the advancement of Russian geopolitics on a global level. So once again, you have another one of those connections here. And I think this is a significant one here. And perhaps one of the things we'll get into, perhaps one of the things with this money trail that is being investigated here, it appears, with relation to PsyGroup, is that this could potentially reveal some, could also connect some more dots together as far as perhaps a Russian, or at the very least an international mob interest in this whole PsyGroup operation and some of these other operations that were taking place, which were integral as far as some of the optics of the Trump campaign in 2016. Of course, PsyGroup, once again, that goes back to the obvious heavy Zionist influence of the Steve Bannon Council for National Policy, Breitbart-oriented wing that took over the Trump campaign in the late summer of 2016. So we'll see what kind of answers come out of this here, hopefully in the coming weeks and months.
Yeah, and that reminds me of that interesting the symbolics of the transfer of the campaign from the Manafort hands to the Bannon hands, and of course it's still the network is pretty firmly there, but in some way you can see the Manafort hands are a little bit more maybe leaning towards Moscow centric in a certain way, and then the Bannon hands tend to lean more Tel Aviv, Jerusalem centric. With of course the common thread is of course the United States of America.
That, and I think Brexit also, and we've mentioned that before, is it seems like a coming together or connecting pad of some sort, as you had obvious Russian interest in terms of Brexit, a UK that would be less inclined to the European Union, as well as Israel. Of course, it was Breitbart, the Israeli conceived in Israel publication, that led the push for Brexit, and that was the primary media force that was behind Brexit. It ultimately became probably the primary media force behind Trump, and of course Russia and Israel have a common interest in terms of there is a somewhat of a commonality in that both see elements of the European Union as a threat to their respective interests, as Michael Oren has been on record saying. So,
yes. And of course, like that's a simplistic, what I was saying is a simplistic shorthand in many ways, in terms of Manafort being more part of the Russian sphere, representing that, and Bannon representing more of the Israeli sphere. Because of course we covered a little bit and spoke about what came out about how Manafort had been part of his Ukrainian operations, part of his Ukrainian information warfare operations, had to do with even utilizing one Avigdor Lieberman, highly suspected within Israeli society as potentially having some type of Russian intelligence or Soviet intelligence background of some sort. And we've also pointed out the on-the-ground closeness, similarities to members who were sent to the United States from that were very much tied into what became the Mogilevich network, and that's where Lieberman comes from. But we found out in the midst of this investigation, of course, that Manafort was utilizing Avigdor Lieberman and apparent information, and I believe Lieberman at one point was the head of the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs, which has been so now outed by this now leaked Al Jazeera documentary about the Israel lobby in the United States of America, that it's basically at some way run out of the Ministry of Strategic Affairs in Israel as a way to attack American activists. And so I believe Lieberman had been at the head of that. He's held many positions in the Israeli government, I believe, including defense minister, including foreign minister. But Manafort was utilizing some Lieberman washed information, supposedly of some sort, that was going to be used and then pushed into the American press. That Hillary Clinton was surrounded by or was involved in anti-Semitic activities, political activities of some sort, and of course, who's the person who then it's given to in the American press is one Ben Shapiro. That at that point I was just at Breitbart News, so
he just wanted his sister to be able to get a passport that said Israel.
Yeah, that of course, you know.
But what you're seeing here, and I think there may have been a report in one of the Israeli papers that Lieberman's office had publicly claimed that there was no type of coordination with Manafort and his people. But at the very least, you see, there was you have this Shapiro Breitbart connection. You very openly have this obvious Breitbart style interests that are pushing very similar kind of hard right, extreme right wing policies for the state of Israel that someone like Avigdor Lieberman is so prominently at the forefront of within Israeli politics. So at the very least, there's definitely a continuation in that regard as well. If it wasn't Lieberman himself personally, it was people who would just say very ideologically closely connected to him. So
yeah, and for all of like the. You know, we all know the amount of cover being run for Donald Trump and his blatant ties to these organized crime networks that tie into both Russia and Israel most obviously. That's so much coming from all these aspects of the right and the sort of pseudo right and increasingly with the whole InfoWars crew and their obvious alliance with the Breitbart crowd and all of that in relationship to the Donald Trump election. There's also an ongoing left, maybe faux left, we might even call it, doubling down about trying to apparently cover up these very obvious and politically relevant material connections of Donald Trump to these very same networks, which would include the people like the Aaron Mates in relationship to The Nation, or formerly of the Real News Network, or of Jimmy Dore, who's been involved with the Pacifica Network and the Young Turks, who are still basically giving the line of the Chomsky line on 9/11. There's nothing there. And of course, like we pointed out before, one Jimmy Dore already on 9/11, even though he's called a conspiracy theorist on 9/11 by some of the sort of mainline Russiagate hashtag resistors because of just questioning aspects of 9/11. When it really comes down to it, and Jimmy Dore's asked about 9/11, he says, well, Chomsky says there's nothing there, so there's nothing there. So similar to that, that's sort of the line that they apparently are going to continue to pursue rather than look at the actual evidence here. And the evidence is that what was about to come up in the second Manafort trial, I believe, their list of evidence was things like bank accounts, such as I believe it was called Lucicle, Lucicle, that Craig Unger, I think, is directly connected to the Firtash Mogilevich crime network. And so it should be a basic piece of evidence is who is Semyon Mogilevich? What is his connection to Robert Maxwell? What is his connection with Vladimir Putin? Was he at the table during when Putin won his election in 2000? And all of these types of things. And then what is the relationship of these people in either the Justice Department or the FBI who have been intensely targeted, such as people like Bruce Orr, by Donald Trump, where it's lots of public tweets about some guy in the Justice Department.
Even Andrew McCabe now, too, as well, it seems like.
Yes, and what is the background of all of these people in relationship to these specific groupings of Eurasian organized crime, and even specifically the Mogilevich network? And this is material that really should be dealt with in a serious political fashion by these aspects of the left. So I just wanted to point that out at this point too. But then moving on in terms of this Robert Young Pelton Twitter thread, underneath this first tweet that we read, there is a chart that we'll maybe get into a little bit later here that deals with the complicated financial background or the ownership network that stands behind PsyGroup. And it includes, we'll include a link to it so people can look at it, but it includes things like the connections to the Trident Trust, which is held in Cyprus, and that owns one of 16 subsidiaries. It's also connected to Malteria Holdings Limited, which is then also I believe, owns the MGTM Financial Services Limited, which is that's directly tied back into what's called the Metropole Group in Russia. The founder and owner of that, which is Mikhail Slipenchuk, Slipenchuk, who was part of Putin's party and was in the Duma into 2016 when he was then had to resign. And so in the middle of all of this is the Protexter Limited British Virgin Islands held group. And all of this is in the background of the holding of the PsyGroup. And there's lots of very complex cutouts in relationship to making this very difficult to see what the actual, who's holding this financially, this PsyGroup. So moving on, the next tweet from Robert Young Pelton says, "We interrupt this thread, Dateline Toronto, where a Cerberus alum at Catalyst/Calidus hire both Black Cube and PsyGroup to screw over opponent Westbank in court by using fake people to trick employees, provoke anti-Semitism, and spreading fabricated dirt." And
once again, Cerberus Steven Feinberg. So
very interesting. And I remember this at the time of this other aspect of the way that Black Cube was working in conjunction and the dirty kind of tricks that they were using, even against, I believe, a judge. So people can go back and refresh their memories about that. So continuing on, the next tweet says, "Legal docs show that BC, Black Cube, does fake people, and meaning PsyGroup, does fake news. And they both work together, and they are from the same Israeli dirty tricks. Channel 4 nails SCL/CA, that's strategic, what's it called again? Strategic Communications, the SCL group, which is the father group.
I forget the particular name of the SCL group, but it's definitely the parent company of Cambridge Analytica, which is obviously used here domestically.
Yeah, and so that's what that's referring to, is the SCL group /CA is Cambridge Analytica. Channel 4 nails them on honeypots and dirty tricks, and Canadian Wiley fills out how SCL delivers it. And people might want to go back to that. There was an interesting series of videos put out by Channel 4, I believe this is in the UK, that had to do with this background of Cambridge Analytica. So then, the next tweet by Robert Young Pelton, August 29th, 2018. Nader, remember George Nader,
Yes.
Up to his neck, along with one Elliot Broidy in things like the RNC money, right? Nader pays Zamel $2 million after the election. December 14th, 2016, Cambridge Analytica signs an MOU with PsyGroup to get a $500,000 no-bid GEC gig. I don't know what GEC is. Mueller grabs Zamel's computers. Boom, they go tits up. Then a la Terminator, everyone reforms into Johnson Co., Mercer, Emmer Data. Boom, then Auspex, Splat, then Data Propria. And the Mercer, the Emmer Data is the one, I believe, that's also, it seems to involve the Eric Prince network, I think. Then, moving on, Data Propria, which is made up of Cambridge Analytica alums, is happily and quietly working away on Trump 2020. Zamel and Black Cube await the call, and no, you can't have your stolen Facebook data back. And it references an AP News story about how Trump 2020 is working with ex-Cambridge Analytica staffers. And I think it's a picture of Brad Parscale.
Wonder if Michael Glassner, how affiliated he is with all of this, since Glassner, I believe, is on Trump's re-election committee.
At some level, Glassner, I imagine, helps hold the whole operation together at some level. That's what I would imagine.
Just wondering about that.
So the next tweet, and now we know from documents and investigations related to Cengiz. By the way, Cengiz, right, the Persian Jewish billionaire who's in the background of way back of the SCL group, and I believe we've read that he was the first user of Black Cube before having some type of public spat or split with them. So related to Cengiz, and now we know from documents and investigations related to Cengiz, Hapoalim, which I believe is one of the two biggest banks in Israel. And I believe Hapoalim is also, this is a sort of a tangent, but I believe we've covered this before, that the man who came up with the show that the show Homeland comes out of, I think, comes from a Bank Hapoalim background. And David Boies, I think he's referring to Boies, Boies, Deripaska, Weinstein, Kalidas, Iran sanctions, right? That's what you also made the call about, Greg, right? To C-SPAN when Ben Rhodes, the former Obama official, was on there.
And I believe Ben Rhodes had said he wasn't, I don't know if he was overly excited about answering the what I had mentioned, but he did pretty much say that this was the most, I think, most blatant example of like open foreign interference in a country's affairs that he'd ever seen. I believe he said something along those lines. So
pretty intense. So Iran sanctions, Nader, Prince, Romania, and many more, that this dirty tricks view of politics is an Israeli export. And then it links to a Mint Press news story titled PsyGroup to Black Cube, Israel's role in global cyber election meddling, I think it says. And then finally, the last tweet, spring 2012, Eric Prince met Dorian Barak via Ari Haro, who introed them to Vincent Cengiz and partners Zorella and Janus when Prince, Haro, and Barak were partners in Indigo Strategic. Late 2012, Blackwater hired Boies and friendship began. Boies hired Black Cube for HW. I don't know what HW. Oh, Harvey Weinstein. Right, of course. David Boies hired Black Cube for Harvey Weinstein. So it goes.
This is an amazing thread, by the way. This is really tying together dates and times. And I hadn't even seen this thread. And this is an amazing thread. It's tying together dates and times with specific mentionings of when people got together and the specific. Once again, you're seeing the central role of Eric Prince. Not only it appears to just PsyGroup and the things related to what was going on with these not Latin American, with these some of these Middle Eastern kingdoms and the the Arab world kind of uniting in for the first time in a more of a pro-Israel direction, as we're certainly seeing with Saudi Arabia under Mohammed bin Salman, but also even with Black Cube, which has carried out the common interest of targeting victims of Harvey Weinstein, as well as targeting proponents of the Iran nuclear deal under the Obama administration. So we're seeing Eric Prince pop up here, appears with top figures associated with Black Cube. So.
Yes, and so let's just delve a little bit more deeply towards the end of the show here in terms of the current questions that are being openly considered in the basically mainstream press about this PsyGroup connection. And it does tie back in somewhat to the Panama Papers, which I remember at the time that everyone from the Alex Joneses and the sort of controlled right to, again, back to some of these folks on the left, we're both poo-pooing because of the connection to George Soros. This is a George Soros operation, or that it's a CIA funded operation to investigate the Panama Papers because some of it exposes the Putin's interest. But I think it's important for us to look back to it. So here is an article fairly recently, just from less than a month ago, in the Daily Beast, titled "Swiss Mystery Company is at the Heart of a Mueller Puzzle." You've never heard of Zurich-based Salix Services AG, that's SALIX, but Robert Mueller's team has, by Aaron Bonko and Adam Ronsley on February 12th of 2019. I'm going to just read some of the article, and Greg, hop in if you want to. Quote, a little-known company located in Switzerland has come under scrutiny by the special counsel's office for its connection to PsyGroup, the firm that created a social media manipulation plan to help Donald Trump win the 2016 election. That's according to 3 sources with knowledge of the office's questioning and documents obtained by the Daily Beast. Former employees of PsyGroup said the FBI interviewed them in 2017 and asked detailed questions about the firm's business and ownership structure. These same sources told the Daily Beast that while working at Psy, which is now defunct, they operated under the understanding that Joel Zamel, an Australian with links to Israeli intelligence, ultimately owned the firm. But the financial structure of PsyGroup was much more complicated, they said, and included offshore entities registered in the British Virgin Islands. At the end of that chain of opaque offshore entities sits a Zurich-based financial services group known as Salix Services AG, according to interviews with former PsyGroup employees and 2 other individuals with insight into the firm's ownership. And financial documents appear to show a relationship between Salix, named after the Latin word for a willow tree, and at least one of the companies that owned PsyGroup. Robert Mueller's team has eyed Salix as part of his wide-ranging probe into foreign meddling in the 2016 presidential elections. Details about PsyGroup's financials and its ties to Salix could shed new light on a pair of mysteries that could be key to this part of the special counsel's probe. Why did international business and influence peddler George Nader pay Zamel $2 million after the election? And where did all that money go? On its blander-than-bland website, Salix offers few clues about its operations. Quote, like the willow, at Salix our roots as well are deep and run wide through a network of clients, professional intermediaries, financial institutions, and family offices, unquote, the site reads. And the company did not immediately respond to a request for comment. Zamel's lawyer declined to comment. The special counsel's office declined to comment. For more than a year, PsyGroup, and by the way, right, Greg, Zamel's lawyer, I believe, refers to one Mukasey.
Mark Mukasey, the son of Michael Mukasey, who was the attorney general, who was an attorney general under Bush. And it's interesting that, when you think of the Trumps and like the whole narrative of like the Zionist, Jewish Zionist opposition to Donald Trump, you never hear about, Michael Mukasey. And the few times I've seen Michael Mukasey, he's been very defensive of Donald Trump. He's a favorite of Judge Jeanine Pirros, for example, on Fox News. And also it was, I believe Mark Mukasey was being considered to replace Preet Bharara, who was very notorious for his investigation of organized crime as the Southern District Attorney for the state of New York. And there was talk of Mukasey replacing him. And I also point out one more time real quick with Mukasey that Rudy Giuliani specifically mentioned to Judge Jeanine on Fox News that Mukasey helped him and Trump draft the Muslim ban that was so controversial in the first weeks of the administration. So
good point. Okay, back to the story. For more than a year, PsyGroup and its owner, Zemel, have flown somewhat under the radar, despite the questions they've faced about their efforts to use online propaganda to help Trump win the presidency. The New York Times was the first to detail PsyGroup's plan. And on Monday, The New Yorker published a detailed story about the firm and its operations, calling it a, quote, private Mossad for hire, unquote. But Zemel's involvement in any plan to help Trump win through an online propaganda campaign has remained somewhat elusive. Former PsyGroup employees previously told the Daily Beast that they believed Zemel could have carried out a plan separate from the one they pitched to Trump World in 2016. In August 2016, Zemel met with former Blackwater founder Eric Prince, Donald Trump Jr., and Nader to discuss ideas that could potentially help Trump win the election. During that meeting, as first reported by the Times and later confirmed by the Daily Beast, Nader told the room that the crown princes of both Saudi Arabia and the UAE were eager to help Trump win the election. Now, an aside, remember that what's also going on in the background right now are the questions about Jared Kushner's, how Jared Kushner got his security clearance when he had so many compromising things in his background, specifically financial compromise. And it looks as if John Kelly has now said that he was told directly by Donald Trump to override the suspicions of Jared Kushner and give him his security clearance. And then also one last thing in that, and I'll pass it back over to you, Greg, is that this is also the moment where it's pretty obvious that the Trump administration is pushing the nuclear assistance, nuclear weapons assistance, it really looks like, to the Saudi kingdom. Of course, in the wake of all of the questions of the Saudi coup by MBS and also the Khashoggi questions.
Yeah, and then of course, once again, that pops up those reports that Blackwater, or at least what Blackwater, whatever, I forget the current name of Blackwater, but that Eric Prince affiliated figures were involved with torturing Saudi royal figures at the in Riyadh. So you see that, and in addition to that, I'm glad you mentioned that once again, because with this Saudi Arabia thing, it's very key that this is obviously a very important proponent of what's going on with the Trump administration's foreign policy. And once again, I would link people back to the grand bargain as Seth Abramson laid it out. And you see this with Kushner and the security clearance and why this is so important. And John Kelly, where is he? Well, he's no longer with the administration, that's for sure.
It's true, and there's an aside here, maybe we'll cover this in our next show, but the John Kelly nomination originally was what indicated to us, because of his former role as, I believe, the head of Southern Command, and also then ultimately makes his way into Department of Homeland Security, that indicated the looking forward at that point in early 2017, the Trump administration's eye on Venezuela potentially. And so we'll put all that complex question aside for now, but remember that Kelly is tied into those indicators back then. And So, yes, and one last name we should, of course, bring up when you think about things like the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and also its connection to Israel and things like nuclear technology, is one Michael Flynn, who was deeply involved in the midst of that, even while the Trump inauguration was going on. Michael Flynn was working on calls that had to do with apparent Middle Eastern nuclear transfer, I believe, specifically surrounding Saudi Arabia. And I believe there's also still a deep probe into the questions of potential even money laundering or definitely financial shenanigans surrounding specifically the Trump inauguration funds, who I believe people like Elliot Broidy and Nader and all of these people were deeply involved with, but also put people like Russian Jewish oligarch Viktor Vekselberg at the key tables at that point too. So moving on, back to the Daily Beast article.
Oh, real quick, don't forget Louis Eisenberg as well with the inaugural committee.
Oh, for sure. There you go.
New York Port Authority head, so.
There you go, 9/11 to 11/9. That's the real estate transfer,
including
again.
Michael Glassner and also Ronald Lauder, who are also significantly involved. So,
well, thank you for bringing that up, Greg. And Zemel, through his lawyer, has previously denied pitching an official plan for the campaign or working with campaign members. Two other sources close to the Trump team said they did not believe Zemel or PsyGroup carried out an official cyber campaign. That to me sounds like what Dennis Ross responded to my question at the library about how it was not U.S. and Israeli policy, open policy to use terrorism. That sounds like a non-denial denial to me. But according to the New Yorker, back to the story, Zemel told Nader after the election, quote, "Here's the work that we did to help get Trump elected," unquote. Nader's payment of $2 million after the election went through to Zemel. Exactly what for, that's unknown. The ultimate beneficiary would offer clues. Lawyers for Zemel, a self-styled Mark Zuckerberg of the national security world, have previously refused to say how much of a stake he held in PsyGroup and therefore how much controlling power he had over the company. But records obtained by the Daily Beast show Zemel as a director of the company that owns Psy. Furthermore, documents reviewed by the Daily Beast and interviews with individuals familiar with PsyGroup's financial structure lay bare a complex web of companies with connections to Zemel that point to Salix. Quote, "It's how Joel holds his shares," unquote, one former PsyGroup employee told the Daily Beast. Quote, "They set up trusts and provide nominee services to shield beneficial owners from their holdings. It's completely legal," unquote. PsyGroup, registered as INVOP in Israel, has its ownership obscured by a series of offshore companies. In June 2018, after the company's name surfaced in the Mueller investigation, employees asked an Israeli court to liquidate the company, and financial records revealed that all of PsyGroup's shares were owned by a Cyprus-registered company known as IOCO Limited, IOCO Limited. Former PsyGroup employees also told the Daily Beast that IOCO was, quote, "just another name for Psy," unquote. Since its creation in 2014, IOCO's shares have been owned by a handful of companies registered to post office boxes in the British Virgin Islands. Bank records show that the ownership of IOCO changed hands on a roughly annual basis through a rotating cast of anonymous offshore companies.
Interesting you mentioned, everyone, just want to say this real quick, British Virgin Islands, the Amway Corporation formerly owned an island in the British Virgin Islands called Peter Island. I believe it's now owned by members of the Van Andel family, which is one of the founding families of Amway. So I find that interesting. The British Virgin Islands is involved there. And once again, you get the whole Amway, Eric Prince connection to the highest levels of the Republican conservative establishments. I thought that was interesting.
Great point. And in our last 30 seconds here, I'm just going to read two last paragraphs and we'll wrap it up and link to this all. Leaked documents from the Panamanian law firm Mossack Fonseca showed that a company named Cornell Enterprises S.A. was at one point a shareholder of Prime Nominees Limited, IOCO's sole shareholder from late 2015 through mid-2016. Salix is listed in the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists Panama Papers as an intermediary of Cornell, and Cornell shared an address with Salix in Zurich, Switzerland. Protexter Limited, another former owner of IOCO, is listed as a subsidiary of the Trident Trust Company, Cyprus Limited, which currently serves as secretary on the board of IOCO. So we'll leave it there for now, but it's good to be back in the saddle, Greg, and we will talk to everybody next week. AnteDote.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much.
AnteDote, we out. Bye.